Thank you for joining us for the Meditation Center's monthly metaphysical lesson. This month our theme is Emerging in a Brave New World. When I was 7 years old, I had my first experience with cicadas. These strange bugs came up out of little pencil-sized holes in the ground and made lots of noise and left little hard shells of their former self stuck to trees and bushes everywhere. During that emergence, my family made an impromptu trip to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. It was dark by the time we got there, but we decided to walk up to the boardwalk and see the ocean. Along the way, we got a chance to see a cicada beginning to emerge from its exoskeleton, attached to a tree along the sidewalk. What a curious thing for a 7-year-old to see. By the next morning, the emerging cicada's wings had spread out and dried, and it was ready to fly, in a totally different world from 17 years earlier when it had burrowed into the ground as a nymph. Every 17 years, I eagerly look forward to seeing this cycle repeating itself. A few days ago, I saw a quote that tugged at my consciousness. Don't be afraid to start over. It's a chance to build something better this time. As I contemplated on this idea, I started thinking about how our lives have been changed over the past year by the pandemic and how we have adapted. But at the same time, so many of us feel intimidated by the idea of returning to what we remember as normal. Then came the image of the brood 10 cicadas now emerging from their shells, perfectly synchronized with us emerging from our own shells we've created in response to the pandemic. We can't go back, but we can grow. We have a tendency to hold on to our past and to what is familiar to us. Change can be intimidating and quite uncomfortable. Yet we are forced to accommodate changes constantly. The pandemic is one more thing we've accommodated. But somehow it feels different from the usual life disruptions we experience. What if the vaccine doesn't last very long? What if we accidentally make someone else sick? What if someone else accidentally makes us sick? The possibilities are daunting, yet we keep getting reassurances about the safety of the vaccine and our own safety once we develop immunity. It's been well over a year since we were asked to build a cocoon of protection against the virus. We learned to stay at home. We stayed away from other people and learned pretty quickly, and sometimes not, how far 6 feet really is. We've been conditioned to keep to ourselves. We see people doing ordinary things on television, and we feel uncomfortable when they get too close, or hug, or have a party, or anything else that we've learned to separate ourselves from. In so many ways, we have burrowed ourselves away like a cicada, in our own little shell, protected from the hazards of the world. Now we're being told that vaccinated people can mostly return to normal activities. We don't need to stay burrowed in our safe place. We can think about meeting in person instead of on Zoom. We can go outside and have fun. We can be around other folks who've been vaccinated without worrying about what might happen. How exciting and how scary. We're creatures who naturally adapt to our environment. Being in a situation that feels safe, however uncomfortable, has made us aware of our vulnerabilities. And now we're free to be vulnerable. It's like we've been in a cocoon for the past 14 months, and now we're getting ready to emerge, just like the cicadas. But now what? A hint can be found in Scripture, Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. This scripture provides a powerful metaphysical lesson. It's actually quite literal, but spiritually, it still might be easy to miss the point. We tend to get caught up in the patterns of our life, the routines that give us comfort in their regularity, the reliability. Just like the sun rising in the east, we know that our sibling will be upset if we tease them. We know our job will probably be there tomorrow, even if we don't always want to go. We know that there will be turmoil in the Middle East, and that political parties will find ways to contradict each other. But what happens when something changes? The power goes out, or a service station runs out of gas, and the whole world seems out of whack, and we don't know how to handle it. Think back to March 2020, when stay-at-home orders went into effect. Suddenly, it was wrong to head out from home unless it was something urgent. No restaurants, no parties, no picnics, no work, no toilet paper. It was a big change, and people didn't handle it well. Some folks cowered in fear, while others pretended nothing was wrong, and no matter what people did or didn't do, there was always someone ready to condemn them. It was almost like we couldn't win for losing. But then we adjusted. We started discovering that there were things we could do safely, and we learned to adapt to the things that were not safe. We learned about social distancing. We learned about spreading droplets and minimizing the risk by wearing a mask. Those things became a safety blanket for us as we learned to navigate good and bad. We had to live without hugs. We had to live without being able to see our loved ones. We watched our loved ones die alone, and it brought extra sadness and frustration when we didn't have a chance to say goodbye. We now had a new pattern of our world. How did we manage? We had to change the way we think. That is the renewing of our mind. Instead of getting hung up in old assumptions, we had to create new ones that accommodated our safety, and our life changed accordingly. And now those assumptions are changing again. They aren't changing back to the old ones, but to a new set of rules that combine the comfort of the old days with the wisdom that the pandemic has brought. What do we do now? As our scripture says, we will be able to test and approve what God's will is. We can try what works, learn what doesn't, and adapt like we always have. Remember that by God, we don't mean a man in the sky judging us. God is the force of life and creation that pervades everything. Everything is God, even the parts that intimidate us. It's the God energy that expresses within us that we're testing when we go through a change. We learn what works, and we learn what doesn't, and we adapt accordingly. We don't have to like everything, but we still must learn to live with everything. And that's why the renewing of our mind is so important. So often we hear people in churches talking about repenting. Repenting doesn't mean begging for forgiveness. It comes from a word in ancient texts that means changing our mind or changing the way we think. That is what our scripture is talking about when it says renewing your mind. When the scripture refers to testing God's good, pleasing, and perfect will, it doesn't mean we're trying to please a source outside of ourselves. Call it destiny, or kismet, or divine order if you prefer. It's a simple, profound way of acknowledging the expression of God consciousness within us and saying, it's all good. I remember a woman I used to know. Her husband had died years earlier, and she coped by dedicating her life to keeping her husband's memory alive. She was a retired opera singer, and her husband was a musician. Together, they had a business where they taught music and voice coaching. After her husband died, she kept the business going. She kept their house exactly the way it was when he died, and she dressed the way he liked her to dress, despite the fact that fashions had changed several times since. A friend of mine met her at a party and asked me when her husband had died. From her words, he perceived that he had just died recently. In fact, it had been more than 10 years. Like a cicada nymph, she had formed a protective shell that made her feel safe and comfortable, and then burrowed deep into that idea. This eased her mind from having to adapt to the dramatic change that had taken place. Many years later, she was still tightly wrapped in that shell, not ready to emerge. Then, one day it happened. She met a kind gentleman who she found easy to be around, and nature prompted her to start climbing up from the hole she had burrowed into. They talked. They met frequently, and before you know it, she had crawled out of her little pencil hole in the ground and emerged from the shell that had protected her for so many years. Her wings unfolded and dried, and she was ready to fly. Instead of conforming to the pattern of protection she had created for herself, her mind was renewed. She got married, closed her business, sold her house, and she and her new husband moved to Florida to live happily ever after, which they did quite successfully. She is in spirit now, but her story never ceases to inspire me. A cicada doesn't worry about how it got down in that hole, or what has happened during the past 17 years in the dark. It simply emerges in its strange new world and focuses on what it needs to do, without fear, without judgment, without hesitation. We can learn a lot from the cicadas, who have quietly, patiently waited for years to grow into that next phase of life. No matter how intimidated we might feel about the post-pandemic world, this is the world we're in. It's okay to step out of our comfort zone. It's okay to experience something new. It's okay to adapt to something we aren't familiar with without judging or condemning it. It's okay to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Not everything we try will work, but that's okay. It's okay to enjoy the process, no matter what the outcome turns out to be. Every change is an opportunity. Every day is a chance to experience and create something new and better, and to make the best use of the new and different things that we've adapted to along the way. Yes, normal is beginning to return, but it isn't the same normal we had before we burrowed into our safe place. And it's nothing to be afraid of. Now we get to decide what normal will be. Don't be afraid to start over. It's a chance to build something better this time. This is the time to release the patterns of the world and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it's all good. Many blessings. For additional lessons and meditation ideas, visit our website at www.meditatewnc.org. Thank you for joining us.